Hello everyone, welcome to Digital Media E10, Exposing Digital Photography. So today is always one of the lectures that I'm most excited about because for those of you that come into this class with relatively little experience in digital photography and ask what is sort of the fastest way that you can start to improve your skill and start to improve your photography, I think today is kind of it. I think today is sort of the day where you're able to just very quickly start to understand a lot of the settings behind your camera. And from the foundations, from the fundamentals that we'll actually talk about today, we'll see next week that some of the many features of your camera can be distilled to just differences in some of the fundamental settings that we're actually going to be discussing. And so to put a more practical, or rather a less abstract sort of definition behind this, today we're going to be talking about exposure, or the actual method that the camera uses, the variables that go into actually taking a photograph with your camera that actually defines to the camera how bright or how dark that picture is actually going to be. And there's many elements to the word exposure. There's not just the various settings that we're going to be talking about, but also when we're talking about in terms of critique, when we are talking about the exposure of an image, there's a lot of nuance that can be involved there as well. And that is actually something that we may not be able to talk about today in class, but certainly, hopefully, we'll be able to address in future classes on the staff Skype, as we've been doing for all of the weeks past. For those of you that are watching live, feel free to add us on Expo DigiPhoto, and there one of our TFs, Shelly, is actively watching, telling me, poking fun at me even perhaps sometimes, while I say a variety of things that were not meant to be funny but apparently are. So just some reminders about some assignments. We are sort of well into the class now at this point. Problem set 1 is due tonight. It's relatively low impact compared to some of the other problem sets and projects, so this is sort of the time to look at it if you haven't yet. But it's also required setup in order to give you access to the course blog and do all of the other requirements as part of this class. So that's due tonight at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. Project 1 is ongoing. That PDF has already been, that specification has already been released as of last week. That's due a week from today. And just before class, I posted the specification for problem set 2. So again, just as a reminder, of the things to be spending time on in this class, the projects are really the bulk of the time that you will be spending on assignments. Problem sets, they do require time and effort, but you will probably find that the written answers that you have to compile for the problem sets take up far less time and usually are, in many cases, are addressed explicitly in class, either in lecture or in sections as well. So I wanted to mention a little bit more about sections starting today. I sent an email just a little while ago, and I realized it was, there's not a lot of lead time for this, but starting today, we are going to be starting our sections. We have 4 different sections. 2 of them are online, and 2 of them are in person. So the online sections are hosted by Shelly and Henry. So beginning this coming Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, you can log into Skype and Shelly will be on to guide you through section. And on Saturday at 1 p.m. Eastern, Henry will be leading online sections also on Skype. Depending on the number of people that show up, Shelly and Henry may ask to move to some other software, to some other program, depending on need, and just sort of see how these things work out. But at least for now, we will start on Skype. Add us again at that same staff Skype, Expo DigiPhoto, and we'll be able to kick off online sections from there. Now, if you are local, or if you have the opportunity to come to one of our in-person sections, then I recommend that you do that instead. We have kind of a generally 50-50 split in this class between students that are either totally local or hybrid distance, which means that they're at least in the New England area, though granted that's still kind of a big area. I wouldn't fault those of you that live up in Maine to not want to come down every week. But still, we do have these in-person sections that if you are able to attend, I recommend that you do. On Wednesdays, starting this coming Wednesday, Rob will be hosting it in Seaver Hall. And starting today, immediately after class, in this room, we will have our first section led by Jordan. So After class finishes, after this lecture finishes, it'll be about a 10-minute break for us to stare down the camera, and then Jordan will begin section at that point. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of what to expect in section, it is not going to be just a mini lecture. It's not necessarily going to be a rehash of the topics given in lecture, unless that is where the discussion goes. It is meant to be much more open-ended. It's meant to really, the TFs are there to foster a discussion about a variety of topics that are even tangentially related to lecture, and it's a good opportunity for those of you that bring your camera, have questions about your specific camera or your specific usage of software on your computer, to bring those to section and actually ask for advice on how to help with that. There's each one of the TFs will probably lead section in a slightly different way, and hopefully you will get, if you're able to attend multiple, sort of attend each one and see which one works best for you and your particular style, because we have a lot of different opportunities here for going over this material. However, the sections, even though they will not be strictly like mini lectures, the topics will generally revolve around the topics that was presented in the previous lecture. So the upcoming sections for this next week will generally be based on exposure and related topics there. But this is also a fantastic opportunity for those of you to apply the sort of theory that we're going to talk about exposure to your own specific camera. So how do you actually modify the shutter speed or the F number on your camera? These are excellent questions that can be done in section. Now, I don't think any of us know all of the different types of cameras available and the way to modify settings on those, but we'll certainly empower you to find out how to do that, even if we don't know necessarily right off the bat what the answer is to what dial to press to change the shutter speed on your camera. But generally, it's easy enough to find out. Any questions on sections before we move on? It's also a great way to present critique photos in person, which, as a reminder, not only are we hoping that you will do that online, but also in person, either here in lecture or in section or something along those lines. So that's an excellent opportunity for that as well. Last year, I know that we had just excellent discussions in section, and it was a great way for everyone to get to know each other and to get to know the TFs. And I think it's a good opportunity overall. And there's one final thing that I want to mention as well. So today as we've been doing for the past few weeks, we're going to continue doing this as well. We've been recording all of these lectures and placing them online. I just want to sort of send a special thanks to Jacob, the man behind the camera, who's been there for 3 weeks. And sad to say that he will have a conflict, and so he'll no longer be able to do this. But thank you, Jacob, for the 3 weeks that you've spent with us putting this online. I know everyone online is certainly appreciative of that. Okay, let's move on to exposure. So there's a variety of topics that we can talk about with regard to exposure, just like I mentioned before, but really today the focus will be on sort of the main 3 features of exposure, the main 3 settings of exposure that many people traditionally think of when we are talking about exposure values and exposure settings on your camera. And each of these is meant to modify, essentially, the amount of light that is captured by your camera to make a photo lighter or darker. You can sort of imagine that the film in your camera or the sensor in the camera, depending on whether it's film or digital, responds to a certain amount of light, just like our own eyes would. If our eyes, just to use our own eyes as an analogy temporarily, if our own eyes are accustomed to a certain amount of light, there might be regions of the room that are too dark for us to be able to perceive. There might be regions of the room that are too bright for us to be able to perceive. And so our eyes have to adjust in order for us to be able to spot detail in various regions of a scene that have very high contrast, very high difference in the amount of light in various regions of the scene. And it's kind of difficult to use our eyes as an analogy for this because our eyes do just fantastic things. And when I'm referring to our eyes here, I mean just our visual system in general, not only our eyes, the anatomical features, but also our brain, which is able to do an enormous amount of visual recovery and visual adaptation in processing the signals that it receives from the eye. But it is still useful in a way to be able to apply some analogy, because in some ways you'll be able to understand right off the bat what some of these exposure values actually do. And we'll get to those as necessary. But in general, we want to modify to some ratio, to some range of light that our camera sensor or film is actually able to appropriately capture. We want to modify the light so that we can actually expose the correct number of photons to that to be able to actually capture the photograph that we want to take. It's sort of one of the easiest ones to wrap our heads around, at least at first, is this idea of shutter speed. And we've talked about the shutter itself as a physical mechanism, especially in terms of single lens reflex cameras. And we talked loosely and very abstractly about the ability of a camera to be able to modify how long that shutter is actually open to capture those photons. But let's talk a little bit more concretely about what this actually means when capturing a photograph. So when we have a shutter speed, we're actually specifying in a precise amount of time that we want the shutter to be open and the sensor to be exposed to photons from the scene. And again, the big picture here is to be able to modify precisely just how much light the sensor is receiving so that it is within the acceptable range of that device so that it can actually capture the tones as expressed in the scene. So if we think of light in terms of that sort of physical particle-based representation that we addressed very early on in the class, we mentioned how light is made up of photons, and we can think of it in some ways as a particle, in some ways as a wave. If we think of it as a particle, light intensity is made up by the quantity of photons that our eyes or a camera is actually able to receive. So if we double the amount of photons, we're essentially doubling the intensity or doubling how bright that scene actually is. And so this doubling and this halving is actually a very useful representation when discussing exposure. So even just irrespective of shutter speed, but just talking about exposure in general, we have a term in photography called a stop. And you're going to hear this from now on in many different contexts, that one stop is the difference of intensity of half or double the amount of light. So for example, let's say that we have this scene right now, which has a certain amount of light that's being revealed by the projector and by the lights in the room and so on. There's a certain number of photons that are hitting our eyes in the scene at any given moment. We can say that we can double the intensity of the light by doubling the amount of photons, and that would be one stop brighter, we would say. So that's equivalent of one stop brighter is doubling the amount of photons in the particular scene. And likewise, when we're talking about shutter speed, we could say that we want to have one stop brighter of a shutter speed or one stop darker of a shutter speed by manipulating the amount of time that shutter is open. Because if you think of these photons that are everywhere and that are entering our eyes and entering the sensor, and we want to sort of limit those to a certain range, if we keep our shutter open for longer, then we're collecting more photons, and therefore it will appear as though the scene is brighter. Does that make sense? Are there any questions on that before we move on? That's kind of like the main crux of shutter speed. It's keeping the shutter open for longer collects more photons, thereby making the captured scene appear brighter. So that means that we can think of shutter speed in terms of stops by doubling the amount of time that the shutter is actually open. So if I have a shutter open for 1 second, just arbitrarily picked as 1 second, let's say that I now open in a different camera that shutter for 2 seconds. That camera that now has a shutter open for 2 seconds, is it collecting more light or less light than the 1 second camera? More, right, exactly, because it's open for twice as long, so it's capturing one stop more light compared to that faster shutter speed. And normally, though, having a shutter open for 1 second is kind of a long amount of time. If you were holding a camera for 1 second, I guarantee no matter how much you were trying to stay still, just very small vibrations, just natural sort of movement in our bodies would move the camera and the sensor enough that you would notice just a little bit of blurring. And in fact, blurring is perhaps one of the downsides to manipulating shutter speed when we're talking about exposure. Now, the reason I have the pinhole camera, or the pinhole photo up from the first class here is because this is one of the main reasons that this photo appeared somewhat blurry. I say one of the main reasons. It's not perhaps the primary reason, but it is one of the main reasons why this is blurry. And specifically, it is why everyone's faces are a little bit blurry. No one in this particular, so all of you are very, very still in this photograph. It's amazing, to be honest. Normally, we have at least one person who kind of makes a somewhat dramatic shift from one side to the other, and it looks as though that person's face is smeared across the scene a little bit. And if you think about why this is happening, we're reflecting light. We are reflecting photons all the time. The light that is being illuminated from the lights above are being reflected off my face and my shirt into your eyes in order for you to be able to see me. If you have the shutter open for a period of time that captures my movement, then it will appear as though I am smeared across the screen because that movement is being captured as a collection of photons that move across the scene. So we get this motion blur that we call, that can result in a variety of ways. One, it can be your own movement as you're holding a camera with a very long shutter speed, which means that the shutter is open for a very long amount of time. And it's capturing a lot of photons, but you happen to be moving the camera subtly, and so now everything appears to be kind of, I don't know, it's just like washed out, like there's a lot of movement in the scene. That's one type of motion blur that we might have. But another type could be even if this camera was totally still, which it was because it was on a tripod, and the subjects in this photograph moved, which is what happened to at least a minor degree in this particular case. Now, we might make the argument that there are two different aspects of this scene. There are the items that are immovable, things that did not actually move at all, like the chairs themselves, for example, or this black table that exists at the front of the room. And so those objects didn't move, and they still appear blurry. So this must be this blur must happen as a result, not because of motion blur, but because of something else. And we'll talk about those reasons in a couple weeks' time. But let's think of this in terms of stops again. We have this particular photograph, which required a shutter speed of 30 seconds in order to capture enough light for it to look like this. And even so, I had to go in software and do subtle manipulations to the exposure because my guess of 30 seconds wasn't quite right, and it was just a little too dark. It was a third of a stop off. So generally what you'll see in your own cameras is, yes, things will be manipulated in terms of a stop, but also generally get finer control than that, often half stop or a third of a stop in order to make just more minute changes in the exposure settings on your camera. But let's say that I were to actually, in the first few times that I started taking pinhole photos, I was way, way off on the exposure. And sometimes you would see photos that were very dark, like this on the far left. And as I got a little bit better, I was able to get the exposure a little bit more correct, and so it would appear a little bit brighter, but the exposure still wasn't quite right. Fortunately, this time, just maybe by luck, I got it right, and it was approximately just well exposed. But there's some numbers here. There's minus 2 EV, minus 1 EV, and plus 0 EV underneath a variety of examples of photos. So if I were to manipulate a photo, or if I were to manipulate the settings on my camera to capture fewer photons, then it's going to appear darker. So I can have a stop darker, for example, and it would look like this in the middle. This minus 1 represents a stop difference. This is a minus means that it's darker, so it's minus 1. It's one stop darker in the exposure value. That's what EV means, is exposure value. So minus 2 means that it is now much darker, even compared to minus 1. So if I have some amount of photons that were collected by my camera with the given shutter speed here in this photograph, how many photons did I capture here compared to this in the minus 1? So if it's one stop darker, then I have collected exactly half the number of photons. Well, maybe not exactly, but half the number of photons. I say, well, not exactly because, okay, well, forget I even said that. We're getting into physics properties about like how you can't precisely quantize. Okay, it's fine, doesn't matter. Okay, so of that, so now we have minus 2. So how many fewer photons do we have in this scene compared to the minus 1? Half again, right, because it's one stop darker, so it's again a halving. But let's think about this in terms of the original scene. If I have this apparent brightness, I have some scene with a certain number of photons that were collected by my sensor, and it's now 2 stops darker. How much darker is that? How many fewer photons did I actually collect? So it was half, and then that half was halved, so 1/4. And this is important to realize, is that because one stop is a doubling or a halving in the number of photons, it takes very, very few numbers of stops for that to accumulate very quickly. So, for example, let's go a third stop. If it was another stop darker, how many photons would that photograph have collected compared to the original? An eighth. We just keep going. A fourth would be 16th, and then a 32nd, and so on and so forth. And it very quickly ramps up because it's exponential. It's doubling, basically. So that's sort of the technical explanation here. And thinking about this in terms of shutter speed makes it somewhat easy to understand in terms of this quantity of photons, because I think it sort of makes sense. When you have the amount of time that the shutter is open, then you're going to have the number of photons that are being collected by the sensor. And this is a very important thing to realize, is that is one of the things that you have provided to you in many cameras, is the ability to override what the camera thinks should be an appropriate shutter speed, and for you to define that instead. But there's an important thing about this shutter speed, and we've already talked about it in this previous slide, which was that shutter speed impacts not only the amount of light that was coming in, but also perhaps the final appearance of that scene as a result of any motion blur that might happen in that scene. If you have fast-moving action, for example, you're probably going to need a shutter speed that is different than a scene like this, which is not very fast-moving action, in order to capture that scene in crisp detail without having any motion blur. Now, we talked before about different types of shutters, well, really, we just talked about one type of shutter, the mechanical one with the vertical mechanical shutters that would actually move across the sensor in sort of a vertical fashion. But there's other ones as well, and all of them still have the same idea of shutter speed. You might have some that look like leaves, and they actually kind of open up from the center and close. You have electronic ones, but all of these still have this main idea of being able to control the quantity of photons just through the duration of time that the film or the sensor itself is actually exposed. There's a couple of other things that's interesting about this too. Many cameras, if not most of them, have a maximum shutter open time of 30 seconds. And maximum, I mean maximum duration. So if I were to try to go beyond 30 seconds because this was in fact too dark of a scene, let's say it was a stop darker of a scene, I would need how many seconds of shutter speed in order to capture the same exposure here? If it was a stop darker and this was 30 seconds, I would need a minute. I would need 60 seconds. So 30 times 2 is 60 seconds. I would need 60-second exposure time in order to properly expose a scene that was one stop darker. But I just claimed that many cameras do not allow the ability to exceed a shutter open time of 30 seconds. And that is true with a little asterisk that many cameras also have another mode called a bulb mode, which allows you not to define on the dial the amount of time that the shutter is open, but instead you define the amount of time by pushing and holding the shutter button for as long as you want the shutter itself to actually be open. We'll talk more about that in the coming weeks. It's an interesting way to get around this, but certainly kind of annoying if you have a multi-minute exposure and you need to actually be able to capture that without setting some nice number on your camera. So we've talked about photons. We've talked about this idea that shutter speed allows us to physically block off the number of photons that we're able to capture in our camera. But if we talk about exposure, and just as a very brief but still relevant aside, if we still talk about exposure but in terms of something other than the settings, we can talk about the overall exposure of the photograph itself. And this was something that I invited comments on early on in the class. And I remember someone saying that it may not be very well exposed. And I think that might be true, but only in certain parts of the photograph. For example, at the very top of the photograph, we can see that the light that is being reflected off the sort of the rafters in order. So we are seeing not direct illumination. There's not many lights that are directly illuminating us, but instead all of the lights, it's kind of difficult for you to see at home, I apologize, but you can sort of see here, not all of the lights are shining down on us, but instead are being reflected off the white paint. And so we're seeing sort of reflected light here. But even so, we can see that it's very, very bright region of the frame. And so we could say that it is not necessarily well exposed in this region, but arguably the rest of it and the meat of it, in fact, is perhaps well enough exposed that the tones seem to be reasonably well distributed. We'll come back to over and under exposure in just a little bit, but the key point here is the loss of detail that can occur in the bright or dark areas is really when you want to be evaluating your exposures. When have you actually lost detail in those regions, and is that detail important? Do you have to work harder to refine your photograph to try to get the exposure in those regions appropriate and capture that detail that exists in the scene? Let's come back to this idea of shutter speed and talking about the settings of exposure themselves. So we have shutter speed, which allows us to change the quantity of photons that are captured, and like we just discussed a little while ago, this is also responsible for motion blur. If we have our shutter open for a long amount of time, we could have our subject smeared across the frame, and this may not be something that we actually want, but it could actually be something in your artistic arsenal that allows you to capture and sort of represent movement, even if the photograph itself is a still photograph, even if it is not a video of some particular movement. You generally do want to capture occasionally sort of the visual implication of movement by having it be kind of blurry or by smoothing out some of that motion and not capturing the crisp nature of that motion or just like an instantaneous point in time, but rather just that movement of something across the frame. And you generally can't do that by having a longer shutter speed. So arguably this photograph right here had a long enough shutter speed to be able to capture the movement of the waves just for a brief moment, but not long enough to really make everything appear totally motion blurred. It's not really a word, but you get the idea, I hope. What I'm going to start doing in general is to try to apply some of the exposure values used in a variety of these photographs in the lower left-hand corner of the slides, and you can go back and take a look at them if you're sort of interested to see how we were able to take some of these photographs. We can see here that this shutter speed, there's a couple of other numbers that we'll talk about later, but this shutter speed was still relatively fast at 1/5 of a second. So this is still 0.2 seconds, but that was long enough to capture the motion of the wave, at least in some limited amount. If I had the shutter open for a longer amount of time, this would look even more smooth. In fact, this is a very common thing that you see in scenes of pools or just water in general, is you use as long of a shutter speed as you possibly can in order to really smooth out the motion of that water and get this sort of milky appearance in the water and in the waves. And it can be a very powerful thing and make it look very soothing in some way in that particular scene. But this sort of necessitated something, which was that I could not hold the camera while it was taking this picture, because at 1/5 of a second, I am not good enough to be able to hold still enough that other elements inside this picture still remain sharp. It would have been the case that I would have held the camera, and sure, there would have been motion blur in the ocean as the wave was crashing, but in this case, there also would have been motion blur in the rocks as well, because of my movement would have made the rocks at least appear relative to the sensor itself appear to be moving. So camera shake is a very important thing that you need to try to mitigate. And one of the ways to do that really is just with a tripod, and it's a sort of a fantastic thing. It is sort of the second purchase that I would recommend for those of you that are getting very interested in photography, would be to use a tripod because you're able to mitigate camera shake as a result of you holding the camera for long exposures. And generally speaking, there's a rule that we can try to apply to determine whether or not you will be able to successfully hold a camera at a given shutter speed. And there's going to be a lot of asterisks to this rule that we'll get to over time, but if you imagine the focal length, or in other words, how zoomed in you are on a particular scene, you want to take 1 over the focal length, and that's how long you will be able to hold the camera still enough in order to take a very sharp picture. So the focal length is just a number that can be applied to the zoom level that you have, and if you take 1 over that value, and that's the number of seconds in terms of the shutter speed that you can actually have. Any longer than that, you will actually find that you are at risk of moving enough for the camera to capture the motion blur just of your movement and shaking the camera slightly. Using a tripod then in this case is advised, or really anything. I mean, tripods are great because they allow you to put the camera in a wide array of places, but sometimes they're not available, so you should just use whatever you possibly can. Put the camera on a table. If you must hold it, you can try to sort of brace yourself against something that actually that is relatively stable, and use your hand to sort of to brace the camera by using the forearm and bracing it against your chest. That can help mitigate some of these issues of holding a camera out in a way which will exaggerate motion that you have. So other tricks might be to, as you are readying to take the photo, do it on an intentional and excessive exhale, which when you have inhaled a lot of air, you tend to have more movement than just at the very tail end of an exhale. You don't necessarily have to be loud about it, though, necessarily. Otherwise, maybe you will disturb others. But these are some tricks that you can use to try to combat against motion blur that is present as a result of you moving the camera. And again, I really want to emphasize the difference that in motion blur between you holding the camera and the motion blur that can exist in the entire scene as a result of that, and the motion blur that can result from the movement of the subject. These are distinct things, and certainly something that you need to pay attention to, because the resolution of these two different types of motion blur are different. If it's motion blur as a result of the camera moving, then you have to keep the camera still. But if it's motion blur as a result of the subject moving, then you either have to use a faster shutter speed to try to freeze the motion of that subject, or you have to get that subject to stay still. A tough ask for things like babies and dogs and these sorts of things. So you're already hopefully starting to get a clue of why the shutter speed is so important, in that I must have a fast shutter speed in order to not only freeze the movements of myself holding the camera, but also freeze the movement of the subject, the dog running around, or the baby running around, or the car driving around, or whatever it is that you happen to be capturing. So tripods are a good way to mitigate at least the camera shake that exists because of you holding the camera, but it's certainly not going to help alleviate problems of motion blur if the subject is moving. And this is also relevant to things like optical image stabilization, where we'll get a chance to talk about this down the road, but there's now in recent years, a lot more companies have been putting image stabilization in their lenses as a way to try to combat motion blur, but it of course doesn't really help if the subject itself is the cause of that particular motion blur. Any questions on shutter speed? So if you want a sharp, non-motion blur photo, try to get as fast of a shutter speed that you possibly can. If you want to capture some movement, or if the scene is very dark, then perhaps you want to immobilize the camera in some way using a tripod or some other mechanism and open up the shutter speed for longer periods of time to collect more photons. Relatively simple, right? And we can use this to great effect. We can actually try to maintain we can try to keep the camera still relative to some portions of the image if we want to combine these two features into one thing. For example, let's say that we want to capture the movement of a car, but we want the car itself to actually be in sharp focus. Well, we can use a long shutter speed, but so long as we're able to immobilize the camera relative to the vehicle, then it will still appear as though that vehicle is in sharp focus and there is no motion blur as a result of that. Things like fireworks, I think, are one of the biggest impacts in sort of the knowledge of shutter speed. I think can really help your photographic endeavors with fireworks, because most cameras will default as a result of the fireworks flash to take a very fast shutter speed image of that firework exploding, and you get just this really unimpressive black sky with like the tiniest little streak of light, and nobody cares and nobody wants to see your 40 photos of just that, and that has occurred in a firework. But really what's neat about fireworks is their movement, is the color that they portray, and perhaps some of the fancy new shapes that they have nowadays, the cube ones and those sorts of things. And if you hold your shutter speed open for longer, you can capture the movement of the trail of the firework itself and try to get that into your image as well. So rather than increase the shutter speed, and increase the shutter speed means make it faster, which means capture fewer photons, try doing the opposite and try to capture the trails that your firework is showing. And also sometimes you may just want to have a complete mess of motion blur intentionally or by accident in order to get sort of like a artistic movement that can result in that. Now, it's important to realize that when we want to stop motion, you have to have a very fast shutter speed. Generally for sports or for fast movement, when you have a child or a dog or a car even, you probably will want a shutter speed on the order of about 1,000th of a second. And that is pretty fast. That's very, very fast. There are ways that we can manipulate other settings on the camera so that we can try to capture more photons or try to make those photons that we do capture mean more, quote unquote, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But really, you want to manipulate the shutter for the scene that you have. And sports is one of the times when you want to try, perhaps in most cases, to stop the motion of what is actually happening. So this photo here was taken with a shutter speed of 1/1250th of a second. So let's round that to 1/1000th of a second. What would be one stop darker? From 1/1000th of a second. So one stop darker, as a reminder, means that there's going to be half the number of photons. So what would be our shutter speed in this case? It's either 1/500th or 1/2000th. So this is perhaps the trickiest part of shutter speed. When you have 1 over some number, the bigger number is actually the smaller amount. So 1/2000th is a smaller number. So 1/2000th of a second is actually the case where this would have been twice as fast of a shutter, but I would have collected half the number of photons. Likewise, 1/500th is one stop brighter. So from 1/500th, one stop brighter, again, would be 1/250th, 1/25th, so on and so forth. Generally, the fastest shutter speeds that we see out of cameras are in the range of 1/4000th of a second or 1/8000th of a second, depending on the quality of the shutter mechanism that they're using. Or if it happens to be an electronic shutter, those typically can result in faster shutter speeds as well. But generally at those speeds, you're going to be really capturing, really stopping a lot of motion. But not all motion, as we'll actually see next week. There are times when you will want to try to exceed even your camera's shutter speed to capture even more interesting moments. Like, for example, the path of a bullet or anything along those lines. Anything that happens faster than sort of what we would normally expect to be able to see out of a camera. You would perhaps want to try to exceed that. And we'll talk about methods for doing that next week. Okay, so let's just sort of mentally think about some of the differences in the shutter speed in order to capture more or less light. If I have an exposure value of 1/8 of a second, for example, my camera recommends 1/8 of a second, First of all, that's going to be sort of a red flag in my mind because 1/8 of a second is pretty slow compared to, especially as you saw there was in this photograph back here, there was enough movement even in 1/5 of a second to, or it was open for long enough to be able to capture some movement here. So 1/8 of a second is a red flag in my mind for how slow this is. But if I actually want to try to capture faster motion, I am going to increase that speed to 1/16 of a second, but that also means that by increasing the speed that I'm going to capture less light. So all of this is consistent like what we've been talking about from the start. There's a wide variety of circumstances that you want to use like as fast of a shutter speed as possible, and I think it'll take some time for you to get a feel of it, like an intuition of the motion that you're trying to capture and what shutter speed you might actually want to use. Just as sort of an aside about this particular photo, it is what it looks like. It was a wave that I was trying to capture that surprised me and got a little out of hand. My camera got a bit soaked, and it was, of course, ocean waves, so it was salt water, and so the buttons got a bit sticky. But it actually ended up being fine. And one of the sort of asides that I want to make is that cameras, especially digital SLRs and some of the more expensive mirrorless cameras, tend to have pretty significantly good build quality. Enough so that I always say this every year, and no one has actually done anything incredibly stupid yet, but it turns out that your cameras are probably sturdier than you expect them to be. You can probably put them through more than you think before they actually fail. This camera, after a day of drying out, returned totally back to normal and had no particular problems. And this camera wasn't even weather sealed. There's a lot of cameras that have special weather sealing to block out water and I don't know, freezing cold and all of these sorts of things. But this was not one of those cameras, and it still was able to survive this. And in fact, there's sort of a neat link that I like to show, which is, where is it? That involves the memory card within the camera itself. You might also think that the memory card is at particular risk of water damage. But there are cases where, like this from back in 2007, there was a camera that was submerged at the bottom of the lake for some significant amount of time, like, I don't know, a month or a couple months or something. They recovered the camera from the bottom of the lake, removed the memory card, and it just so happened that that memory card still functioned, that they were able to pull the images off of that and return the card and the camera. The camera itself was no longer functional, but they were able to find out whose camera that was and return it. Now, there's probably sort of a mitigating factor here, which was that because the memory card was actually inserted into the camera and all of the connections were therefore sort of fused with the camera, it might have protected those connections from getting water inside of them. But still, the larger point is that a lot of the photographs that you see here in class and also on the website, which were taken by TFs, were not necessarily made by babying the camera. Sometimes you have to get your hands dirty or your legs dirty if you actually get into a lake in order to capture a photograph of some kind. And I just want to reassure that it's probably okay, but there's still, mitigating actions that you will want to take to try to protect your camera. Like from a few slides ago, I showed this particular image, which is got a little out of hand. There was just a light dusting of snow on the ground, and I wanted to protect my fancy new tripod, so I took some of those umbrella protector plastic bags that fancy restaurants and hotels have. Just grab 3 of them. Then you have 1 leg protector for each leg on your tripod. You just use a little bit of tape at the top, and then you can now put your tripod in just about anything. It's kind of like waders for your tripod. You can put it right into a lake, and it's a great sort of little tip there that you can use. Okay. Now to come back to the topic at hand in discussing shutter speed. Frequently with shutter speed, you actually might want to mix motion with still, as you've seen in some of these cases. There are certainly times when you actually want to be able to use a slow shutter speed in in contrast to these times that you want to capture some fast motion. And there are ways that you would be able to do this. The important distinction is that you want portions of the image to, if you do want portions of the image to look like it is sharp, then all you need to do is make sure that that portion of the image, whatever it may be in the scene, needs to fall, the light from that needs to fall on the same part of the sensor. So there are times when instead of capturing the movement of, say, of something other than the car, in this case the camera was attached to the window of a car and we could sort of see the motion here, it is also possible to be able to follow the movement of some object in a scene and make it appear as though that object has no motion blur while everything else does as well. This takes some practice, but it's actually totally achievable at home. All you need to do is have a long enough shutter speed to be able to capture some movement. In this case, it was 1 second long. And you need to be able to follow the movement of that, of whatever it is that you're trying to capture. In the case of this boat, this took a little while to get just right. But basically, before you take the photo, just start following it and see if you can get just right the speed and the movement of the thing that you're trying to capture. Then start holding down the shutter button and just take as many as you possibly can as you sort of follow it between the blackout in the viewfinder if you're using an SLR. Between the blackout, just sort of use that to make sure that you're still following along the movement of that object, and you generally will be able to get at least one photo that appears reasonably sharp in the subject that you are following with some interesting motion blur elsewhere. In this case, you can also leverage a tripod. Many tripods allow the capability for you to keep the camera still in vertical movement, but allows you to turn and pan the camera from left to right, which can help out with this sort of thing as well. There are also image stabilization, optical image stabilization mechanisms on some lenses that will stabilize only one direction that allows you to take photos like this as well. So many more examples. All of these sort of things that we've been discussing are not necessarily hard and fast rules. You don't necessarily always want to use the fastest shutter speed possible in sports, for example. Sometimes you might actually want to capture the idea of movement, as in the case of the race car in the upper right here, which still is using a relatively fast shutter speed of, let's see, 1/320th of a second, but the car was moving so quickly relative to its surroundings that even that relatively fast speed was enough to provide some sense of movement in the surroundings of that car. And just experiment with different speeds and see what happens to work for the subject, for the scene that you're in, and the whatever you happen to have with you, whether it be a tripod or a railing that you can set your camera on top of, or what have you. Any questions on shutter speed? Cool. So 1 of 3 down. So I've mentioned that there's sort of 3 main settings with regard to exposure that we can try to modify in order to get the scene exposed just right. And each one of these actually does have a visual impact on our image. In the case of shutter speed, we can use it to physically block the number of photons that are entered into our camera. But if we have a long shutter speed, then we're going to be collecting more photons and be capturing the movement of whatever it is in that scene, be it motion blur from the camera moving or the subject itself. But there's another way that we can try to modify the amount of light entering into our camera. And by this is sort of the one that requires the most hand waving. When we talk about ISO, you might equate ISO with how much noise there is in an image. You might have heard the term sensitivity applied to ISO. How sensitive is the camera going to be for a particular scene? And this is one way, modifying the ISO is one way of allowing you to change the shutter speed to some value that you want while still not actually modifying the amount of light that exists in the scene. And there's a reason that sensitivity itself is in quotes, and that's because using the term sensitivity to describe what happens inside of a camera is an analogy. We could certainly use it as an analogy, and you might actually hear me use the term, oh, you should probably use a more sensitive ISO value or something along those lines. But it is not representative of what truly happens in terms of the mechanism for this to function. So I just want to make clear that we can talk about sensitivity. We can talk about ISO in terms of sensitivity, and we can sort of relate to it like that. But it's important to realize that that is not actually what's happening inside the camera. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about digital sensors a few weeks from now. But essentially, if we were to hand wave at that and accept that, okay, sure, it's not actually increasing the sensitivity of the sensor, that's fine. What it does provide is a good analogy for how we can think of ISO. So if I want to allow my camera for a given shutter speed to make it look a little bit brighter, I can say that I want that sensor to be more sensitive, quote unquote, to increase the ISO and thereby increase the brightness of the image that my camera has actually captured at the detriment to noise. So increasing the ISO value of my camera allows me to increase the quote unquote sensitivity, but it does also increase the amount of noise that is present in an image. And this is another important consideration. When you are in a fantastic landscape scene, for example, you don't want noise to mar the image that you actually capture, so you generally want to try to push the ISO as low as possible to eliminate as much noise out of your camera that you can. But this will obviously have an impact on shutter speed. And so generally what you see for landscape photographers especially is that they carry around large tripods so that they can use very low ISO values to decrease the noise in their images, but that also means that they'll have to use a longer shutter speed as a result. And that sort of makes sense, right? If it's more sensitive, if this sensor is more sensitive, then that probably means that I don't need as slow of a shutter speed. If it's more sensitive, I can increase my shutter speed and still get the same apparent view in terms of the exposure out of that particular image. So an increase in ISO, an increase in sensitivity allows me to have a faster shutter speed. And this was terminology that was very popular in the film days. When you would go to the Target or Walgreens or whatever, you would buy film, and if someone helped you, they would ask, well, do you want fast film or slow film? And that's exactly what it was referring to, is you could buy ISO 800 film, which was more sensitive in some definition of sensitive than ISO 100, but it allowed you to use faster shutter speeds. And so it was easy to talk about film in terms of that context, because once you put that film in your camera, that film had the same ISO value for all of the frames that you took, and so you were going to increase the ISO value for 30 some odd photos that you actually took. And as a result, you would have to modify your shutter speed for that film value. And film cameras actually had a pretty clever way of dealing with this. You would actually set, when you put in the film itself, you would set the ISO value that was representative of that film, and you would, if it had some sort of automatic exposure mode, it would take that into account when it was trying to figure out what shutter speed it should actually use. Nowadays, we can actually modify the ISO value on a shot-by-shot basis. Every time we take a picture, we can now modify the ISO on the digital camera to make it a little bit more sensitive or less sensitive to modify our shutter speed as a result. So you can already start to imagine, if you think about some of these different types of photographs that we actually want to capture. If I want to take a sports photograph, for example, and I want to really capture this, I really want to stop the motion as much as possible, perhaps not only do I need to increase my shutter speed to make it faster, but also increase my ISO to ensure that it is not totally dark in the image that I take. And this is just a hint at some of the really stupid hair-pulling modes that many cameras nowadays have. Some of them will have like 50, 60 modes of like beach mode and beach 2 mode and sports mode and all sorts of modes, fireworks modes. It's just all sorts of modes, and I'll rant about this in more detail next week. But they have all sorts of modes, but all they're really doing is modifying these settings that we're actually talking about today. But now, if you have an understanding of what these settings are actually doing in terms of capturing the image and also the impact that they have on your image, then you no longer need to rely on those settings, and you can instead manipulate each of these settings manually and independently to capture precisely what it is that you want. Okay, so just sort of take into account that increasing the ISO value increases the sensitivity. In fact, it works very well. If you double the ISO, you would say that it is a stop faster. So ISO 100 to 200 means it's one stop more sensitive, quote unquote, which allows me to then change my shutter speed. How? How would I change my shutter speed if it was twice as sensitive? Bunny ears. Let's say I had a shutter speed of 1 second. What would be the new shutter speed with ISO 200? Yes? Half a second? That's right, half a second, because it would be faster. Faster ISO would translate to faster shutter speed. And because ISO 200 is twice as much as ISO 100, it's a stop difference, and therefore I can change my shutter speed by a stop. So here's a couple of specific examples that actually show the difference in different cameras and different classes of cameras based on the ISO value. And generally speaking, what we see are that larger, bigger cameras, and really even more generally, we might apply this to larger, bigger sensors, but there's many caveats and asterisks to apply here. Generally speaking, what we see is for a given generation of technology, digital SLRs will tend to have much better high ISO performance in terms of noise. Again, many caveats and many nuances that we have to cover over the next few months, but just generally speaking, we can sort of assume that to be the case. Which means that if we compare the images of the compact camera showing ISO 100, which is generally a camera's lowest ISO value, and ISO 1600, which by the way is how many stops faster compared to ISO 100? 4 is right. So 100 to 200 to 400 to 800 to 1600 is 4 stops difference. So 4 stops faster rather, we can see the huge impact that this noise has on our image. And this isn't really fair, to be honest, because these are ancient cameras at this point. But using ancient cameras allows us to really see the difference in an exaggerated way. But we can sort of see the noise that exists in this photo on the right, even though it's only 4 stops, quote unquote, more sensitive. Notice that there's a lot of properties of this noise. There's not only differences in the brightness of the individual pixels on the right, but also you can sort of see globs of color. There's like some sections that are a little bit purpler in that gray region, and some sections that are a little bit greener compared to the much more fluid, solid gray. It's, again, much easier to see not on this projector, which is only so-so. And compare that to the digital SLR, which has much better high ISO performance. This is generally the thing that we sacrifice in our compact cameras and in our camera phones, is the ISO performance. It is much easier for digital SLRs, for bigger sensors, to have the necessary physical requirements to be able to capture that light. And frankly, this is something that will always be the case. This is actually like a physics problem that we cannot, even in our advancement of technology, that will always be present, is being able to capture more photons and being able to capture more light in bigger sensors will actually always be cleaner in terms of the amount of noise compared to the smaller cameras that we will actually be able to create for a given generation. Okay, let's take a quick 5-minute break. When we come back, we'll continue talking about ISO. Hello everyone, welcome back. So before the break we were talking about ISO sensitivity and how this would impact your image, how you could use it as sort of a shortcut to get additional latitude in modifying your shutter speed, but as sort of penance you would have to get noise as a result. Nowadays, modern digital SLRs are just astoundingly good at increasing their ISO to values that, frankly, in the film days were unbelievable. I mean, back in the film days, you could go to a store and buy ISO 800 film pretty reliably, but as soon as you got into ISO 1600 film, then you were starting to talk about more specialty film that would have just a lot of really large film grains. It would look very, very different. And ISO 3200, well, sometimes you could push that in print, but it was definitely hard. And even a few years ago, maybe even about 5 years ago or so, there was a major shift in terms of more and more digital cameras were just exploding out of manufacturers that were capable of taking ridiculously good photos at very high ISOs. Enough so that ISO, or rather film cameras, largely became just obsolete. And so this is in a picture that I always show, trying to reveal that this is actually the case, where this is sort of as similar of a photo as I could possibly find. There's no, there's sort of no better comparison that I had at the time, but it's both photos are of a face. One of it's in ISO 1600 on the left. It's actually a film negative. When you got to that point, many film, much of the film that you could get was in black and white, especially at the higher ISOs. And so this was a film negative that was entirely in black and white. And we can compare that to the noise that we would see out of a digital camera, the Nikon D3, which is now several years old, but even at ISO 25,600, which is several stops brighter, several stops faster here, we can see that it has almost comparable noise. There's definitely some differences here. The photo on the right is a color photograph. We can see some unusual artifacts in terms of bright spots on the sensor. We can see individual pixels that are very bright that didn't respond appropriately. But we also generally see in digital cameras that the noise is patternized. It looks like there's a pattern to it, that there's some sort of, that it's not quite so random. And that is one of perhaps the remaining things that film itself actually does in a great way. The film grains themselves are randomized along the film, and so it has a much more pleasing look compared to the noise that we can actually get out of the hardware of a digital camera. So manufacturers have tried to combat this by trying to randomize the noise by reading data off the sensor in different ways in order to try to randomize that noise. But even still, nowadays, that we see that many people still have a preference for film noise just by the way that it looks. And in fact, that is a stylistic choice that many people prefer to use, is to add noise that is somewhat random to give it that sort of film, almost nostalgic look that we can get out of film negatives as opposed to digital sensors. And this is an important thing to realize, is that you can actually tell even now when you go to the movies or you watch a TV show, it's almost easy to tell what has been recorded on film and what has been recorded in digital sensors just by sort of the appearance of the noise that exists. And it's sort of a neat thing to pay attention to, which directors actually choose for which films, which of these two mediums they want to do. But nowadays it's getting very hard to find a lab that will process your film. It's also very hard to find just film in general that you can use to actually take photographs with a film camera. But still, there are some diehards with dark rooms of their own that are able to find sources of film and be able to capture that. But still, for us, it's hard to say that it's necessarily a bad thing, that we can now have much more capability out of our cameras by really expanding the ISO range to an enormous degree. Modern cameras now go up to something like 102,400 ISO, which is just obscene. It is basically taking a picture in total darkness with an appropriate lens. There are definitely camera and lens combinations that see far better than the human eye. They can capture far more light than the human eye, which is kind of a fantastic and astounding feature of cameras nowadays. But let's come back to this idea of exposure and how we can actually modify these settings to impact our image. Let's say that I have this particular image here, which was taken on a dock in New Hampshire off Lake Winnipesaukee a few years ago, and I wanted to capture some star trails. And by that I mean I wanted to open the shutter long enough that I would actually be able to capture the movement of stars as the Earth spins through space. You would be able to see like just a nice streak of stars across the sky. I have here highlighted in red a star that when I took this photo to an astronomer, he said, "Oh, that's Vega," and I've never been able to actually verify that, but this is a star in the sky that is called Vega, and that is actually what we're going to focus on in just a minute. But there's a couple of things that I want to point out just about star trail photos in general, which is that notice the appearance of the trails on the far left compared to the upper right. You can see that they appear very different. It looks as though the radius is actually changing, like it's going around a circle and that radius is actually changing. And you can actually tell very easily what direction the camera is pointed in. In this case, it's generally pointing north because we can see that in the upper right-hand corner, it looks like it's a smaller circle. So really it was spinning around in that particular direction, and it's further south down here. It's kind of interesting to see that you can actually find the northernmost points and the southernmost points, particularly in exaggerated star trail photographs, of which this one I think is not quite long enough, but to be honest, I was already sick of being outside in the cold New Hampshire weather. This was, I think, a 15-minute exposure, and it only captured star trails this long. If you really want to capture long star trails, you have to capture a lot of the Earth's movement, which means on the order of hours in order to capture a very good star trail. But all of that stuff aside, the way that I was able to change the length of this star trail is by also modifying the ISO. So there's an important distinction here, is that the amount of light that was present in this scene was fixed. I did not really have the ability to be able to use an enormous million candle power flashlight and shine it everywhere and be able to illuminate more of the scene, to use a different shutter speed or what have you. But instead I had to manipulate the shutter speed and the ISO in order to make sure that the photograph was still well exposed while still trying to make the shutter speed as long as possible, or to keep the shutter open for as long as possible. And in fact, the first time that I took the photo, it looked like it did on the right, which was a 6-minute exposure, but used an ISO of 800 in order to capture this particular image. You can notice that between the image on the left and on the right, there's a little bit more noise on the image on the right, but also the star trail itself is actually a different length. And this is a really good example of how we can change the ISO to also impact the shutter speed while maintaining the same exposure. So overall, there's a slight change perhaps in the relative brightness, but overall it is exposed. They're exposed pretty similarly, which means that we captured somehow the same amount of light, or we were able to capture somehow the same amount of light between each of these. And so if I had a shutter speed of about 330 seconds here on the right, which is about 6 minutes, and I used an ISO of 800, if I wanted to increase the amount of time that the shutter was open, I just halved the ISO to 400, and then I was able to double the amount of time that the shutter itself was open. So this is just a kernel of this idea of how you can take star trail photos, but you actually would need to take significantly longer for it to be at all impressive. Right now, it almost looks sort of like a mistake. And in fact, this is a downside as well to taking landscape photographs outside at night in particular, is it doesn't really take that long for a photograph to have just a hint of star trails in it. In fact, if you take a photograph that's about 30 seconds of exposure outside and stars are visible, you zoom in to 100% on that photograph, you will probably see just a little bit of an elongation on that star, making it look like there's some star trail. And it may not actually be preferable in that case. And so that's something that you have to contend with when you're taking photographs in this case. So these are two of the three ways that we can modify settings on our camera to be able to capture exposure. And it's really nice because we can double them or halve them in terms of their values in order to think about modifying the number of photons that we're capturing in terms of stops. The third thing that we use when we're discussing exposure deals with aperture. And this is a little bit more complicated, but not so much more complicated that we have to that you have to worry about it. But this is the math that's involved with this course. I warned you at the very beginning that we're going to have like a little division and some stuff going on. The math involved with this course really revolves around this discussion of aperture and f-number and what this actually does. Generally speaking, modifying the aperture is like having a different, changing how open the iris in our eye actually is. We can use that as sort of an analogy for what is happening inside of a lens. If we were to change the aperture value on our camera, what we are basically saying is that we want to open or constrict the iris to the camera and allow more or less light in as a result of that. And you can think of this in terms of an actual physical blockage that occurs inside of a lens. And many lenses do have this sort of physical aperture mechanism that changes depending on the setting that you actually use. Normally it happens too quickly for you to notice. Normally the aperture is open all the way to allow in as much light as possible. But during exposure, not only is the shutter mechanism opening and closing, but so is this iris, this plastic or metal iris inside of the lens is stopping down to whatever value you selected and opening back up. And this blockage actually physically changes the number of photons that are being captured by the sensor. If I have some, like a piece of paper with a square hole in the center of it, for example, if I look at how much light is actually coming through and I double the size of that hole, all of a sudden more photons are going to be coming in, which allows more photons to be captured by my sensor, which then again is a way that we would be able to modify the exposure settings on our camera, modify that shutter speed, modify the ISO to achieve the look that we want in our photograph. So generally speaking, bigger apertures, opening up that aperture as much as possible allows in more light. And closing that aperture blocks a lot of the light and reduces the number of photons that are entering into the camera. So the word aperture refers to this physical mechanism itself. The aperture, technically speaking, is just some sort of a hole that allows light to enter through. And we have control over the physical size of that aperture through a setting on our camera that is called the f-number. Now, frequently you will see the terms and words aperture and f-number used interchangeably, and that's okay. That's fine. That happens online sometimes. But there is, in fact, a technical difference, which is that the aperture is the hole itself, and the f-number is actually a ratio, and it is the f-number that we use in the setting of our camera. So this is the scary math that's involved for the class, and I don't mean to be trivializing it because it does get, actually, there are like some logarithms involved and stuff, and we'll talk about that later. But the f-number is really just the ratio of the focal length divided by the effective diameter of the aperture. So this has a big impact. We now have these two different variables that actually deal with modifying the f-number. But really, the way that you want to think about this is that a bigger aperture, having a bigger hole to allow more light in, will allow more light in, and that will impact our photograph in some way. So let's keep this in mind. F-number is the focal length divided by the effective diameter of the aperture, where focal length, again, is some measure of how zoomed in or how zoomed out we are. Again, that's an oversimplification. We'll talk more about what the focal length actually is in the optics week, which is a few weeks from now. But just loosely speaking, that's how we can think of this. So we can look at a lens loosely like this. We have a very simple single element glass lens here, where this is that single element. It has some particular diameter because it's going to be a circular glass lens, and that diameter is going to allow a certain number of photons to enter through it be focused by the lens across some length that is the focal length. And this, again, is an oversimplification of the focal length, but in our case, this is a fine example, and directed onto the film plane itself. So I was talking before about how we can increase the size of the diameter to allow more photons in. We can decrease it to allow fewer photons in. And if you have manipulated the F number setting on your camera, you may have noticed that the numbers seem wacky compared to ISO and shutter speed. It doesn't seem to be as nice as doubling and as a halving. There's like these crazy numbers like 2.8 and to 4 to 5.6 and so on and so forth, which doesn't seem to be as nice of a ratio. But the reason for that all comes down to this thing that I've been trying to say a lot, which is that it is relevant to the size of the aperture itself. But keep in mind that this glass aperture is circular, which means that if I want to double the number of photons entering into this circular device, I need to double the area of that circle. Right? Hopefully that makes sense. If I want to double the number of photons entering into some particular space, I'm going to double the area. And it is that makes the numbers a little bit trickier and not quite as nice as a doubling or a halving. When we are talking about the F number, we're not talking about the area of that circle. We're talking about the diameter. And the relationship between the diameter of a circle and its area is a square. And so we're getting into a little bit more math here. And on the course website, we have a PDF handout that goes into great detail about how precisely we can figure out what one-stop difference is in an F number as a result of this halving and a doubling in the size of the area. But roughly speaking, this is sort of, at least for now, we can think of this as an okay simplification. That we have this diameter, we have this circle that allows in a certain amount of light. We want to double the amount of photons, double the amount of light that is entered into it. So we double the area of that, and that impacts the diameter in a certain way. In fact, it impacts it by a factor of √2, which is why we have these crazy numbers. So generally speaking, what is most useful in a practical sense when we're talking about F numbers is to be able to memorize the numbers that are most representative of stops. And the way that, sort of the easiest way to do that is to start with the number 1 and start with the number 1.4 and interchangeably double them. So we start with 1, I'm going to double that, I'm going to get 2. And then 1.4, double that, I'm going to get 2.8. And continue along in this path to find out all of the difference of one stop in my F number. So 1, 1.4, 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, and now we're getting a little sloppy, but it goes up to 11 in this case, and then 16. This works up until a certain point. I think beyond like 32 or something, this trick no longer works because this is an oversimplification of the math that's actually happening. Again, one of the things that we will go over in section is this aperture and F number handout, but I encourage you to read it on your own as well and sort of get a better sense of why these numbers look so weird. And again, really is related just to this doubling and halving in the size of the area itself. And that's really the main takeaway here. And practically speaking, memorizing this is sort of a good way of knowing what one-stop difference is in each of these values. The trick here is that lower numbers, lower F numbers, result in a bigger aperture, which means that I'm letting in more light. So it's faster further on the left. So the values 1 and 1.4 are faster than the values 5.6 and 8. In fact, 1, an F number of 1, or F1, is one stop faster than 1.4. 1.4 is one stop faster than 2. 2 is 1 stop faster than 2.8, so on and so forth. So I've not lied to you when I said that doubling and halving is the important bit. In fact, that is the case, but because our f number is defined as the ratio of the diameter, but in order for us to double the amount of actual light coming into a lens, we have to double the area of the photons that we're capturing. That is why we get these sort of weird, wacky f numbers. Again, I encourage you to look at it. The math really isn't that bad. It is just taking two circles. The way that you can convince yourself of this, actually, is to take two circles, we'll call it like A1 and another one, that's A2. And we say that the area of A2 is twice as big as the area of A1, and so we find out what that actually means in terms of the difference of the diameters. And because these are squares, we get these numbers out as a result. But there's actually something else that we can do with this ratio as well. We have an f number, we have a focal length, and we have a diameter. So perhaps we can actually take that pinhole lens and figure out precisely what the diameter of that pinhole was. If I am able to measure the focal length, which I'm able to do because I had the pinhole lens, which was attached to the front of the camera, and I could measure the distance between that and the location of the focal plane, or rather of the sensor plane itself, and we know precisely how many stops darker that was compared to some other lens that has the same focal length, so we could figure out what the f number of that actually happens to be. And then from there, we can compute the diameter and figure out precisely in millimeters how big of a pinhole I was able to make. It's all in that PDF, which I, again, encourage you to take a look at. And that is perhaps the most heinous math that we have to use in order to figure out the number of stops. We use a logarithm, but everything else is relatively straightforward. Yes?
I'm a little bit confused when you say faster. I thought that we were talking about like the size of the hole.
Right, so very much so. So the question involves the word faster. So this is like the analogy for ISO. When we increase the sensitivity, we can use a faster shutter speed. In a similar way, if we let in more light, then we can use a faster shutter speed. So this is really just meant to be a tie-in to our discussion before about ISO sensitivity, about how we could increase the ISO and therefore use faster shutter speed. So faster in this case is just a word to represent allowing more light into the camera so I can use a faster shutter speed. So f1 is much faster, allows us to use faster shutter speed compared to 1.4. In fact, it's one stop more compared to 2, 2.8, so on and so forth. And in fact, it's actually pretty neat. You can go and look at the lenses on your, especially your digital SLRs or your mirrorless cameras, and they typically have data printed on the lens itself that tells you the focal length for that lens, but also the f number that is being used by that lens. And that can be very instructive. Generally, what we see are consumer-grade lenses. By that, I mean the less expensive lenses in the range of about 4 to 5.6. And sort of the more quote-unquote professional-grade lenses we would find about 2.8 to 4. And some other ones even go all the way down to 2 and 1.4. And even there are some available that are less than 1. Like there's a ridiculous lens that's f.95, which just lets in, I don't know, illegal amounts of light. It's pretty crazy. But those generally, the faster lenses require more glass because they have bigger diameters and are therefore a little bit more expensive, a little bit heavier, a variety of other things. But we'll talk more about these details in optics. Did you see a question?
So, what do you recommend when you're looking at the lenses and they have a wider range? Like, is that necessarily better than, or is it based off the type of photography you want to do? You know, where I see some that has a wider range for the F versus like some that just have.
So what do we do? So what is the thought process that goes behind deciding on a lens with different ranges of f numbers? Generally speaking, the higher the quality of the lens, the narrower the range. So generally speaking, for a zoom lens, you would have a constant f number across the entire zoom range. It's more difficult to construct, but it also makes it much easier as a photographer to know that you can have a consistent f number at any point in the zoom range. It is easier to construct a lens that has some modified f number across the zoom range because of this ratio. As we change the focal length, then we're actually going to change the f number. But we'll talk more about the specifics there momentarily.
Yeah, I think it's also important to clarify that when you have a lens, say like 2470 at 2.8, 2.8 isn't the entire, it's like not locked at 2.8. That's like the maximum openness that it can be. It can actually close down to like f22, I believe, for that lens, and some of the lenses f32. So it's like they have a whole range that you can play with.
Yes, so just to reiterate for the camera, there's an important distinction here that when lenses print the f numbers on the lens barrel, that is the maximum aperture that those lenses are able to achieve. So in other words, you can still cause the physical aperture inside to close down and use a higher f number compared to that range, but it shows you the maximum number out of the maximum possible number that you can get, the maximum size of the aperture there. And that's generally what's useful to know, because if I have a lens that's f4 and I have another lens in the same zoom range that's f2.8, then I know that my 2.8 lens will be a stop faster. So I can I'll have more latitude, but I can still stop it down. The word here for lenses is stopping it down. If I want to actually change the amount of light that's coming in, I can stop it down to make a 2.8 lens an f4 lens, and it will actually have a physical aperture that closes down inside to reduce the amount of light coming in. That's a good point, thanks. Yes?
Will this hold true for a double reflex lens camera?
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Will this hold true for a double reflex lens camera?
Will this hold true also for a double lens reflex camera? No one has ever asked about double lens reflex cameras before. That's great. And so in terms of the optics of it, it is generally true, but there's probably specifics about the double lens reflex camera that provide caveats that I'm not aware. Does anyone happen to have experience with double lens reflex cameras and know this particular? Okay, we will find out, and we will discuss it in more detail, probably in the optics lecture. Really, the main takeaways here is that we have these f numbers that we can use to decide what the appropriate exposure value is for an image. And if you remember sort of this trick that you start with 1 and 1.4 and you double them in an alternating way, you can figure out what one-stop separation is between each of these. Now, like the rest of these exposure settings, there's a big impact that your selection in the f number will have on your image. And this relates most specifically to the background blur. Generally speaking, the lower the f number that you use, in other words, the bigger the aperture that you're using, the more background blur you're going to get. Now, the discussion of background blur is a lot more complicated than just that, but just generally speaking, for a given zoom, using a lower f number will give you more background blur. So if that's what you're going for, use the smallest possible f number that you can. And also zoom in as much as you can, because that also impacts the amount of background blur that you're actually able to get. In this case, this was an image that uses f4 in order to achieve this much background blur, but it also happened to be the case that it was quite zoomed in, and so we are able to get quite a bit of background blur as a result of that. And many asterisks and nuance available here that we will go over during the optics week, and also the discussion of digital sensors, because the size of the sensor can also impact in some way the amount of background blur that you actually have. In general, lower f numbers, more zoomed in, and bigger sensors will give you like a more pronounced background blur. But at the same time, if you want to try to get more of the scene in focus, so you want to get not only the foreground but also the background in focus, you would do the opposite and increase the f number, which then stops it down and lets in less light, which means that you'll have to modify other values accordingly. So in this case, if I wanted to try to increase the amount of stuff that was actually in focus in my camera, then I need to increase the f number, and I probably need to also change the ISO, maybe increase the ISO a little bit because I'm now going to be allowing in less light into my camera, or perhaps increasing the duration of that the shutter speed is open. So going from 1 second to 2 seconds, for example, in order to accommodate this particular change. Yes?
So f/4, is that, I guess, smaller than f/8 or bigger?
So f/4, is that smaller or bigger than f/8? So if we're talking about the same lens, let's say we have an f4 lens whose maximum aperture is f4, then f8 actually results in a smaller aperture. So if we go back to this idea here for f number, we can think about what changing either the focal length or the aperture's diameter would do to the f number. So let's say that we have a given focal length of, I don't know, 2, for example. Let's say we have 2 something for the focal length, and I have an effective diameter of 1. This means my f number would be f2. As soon as I change the diameter to, let's say, be twice as big, now my f number will decrease to 1. So playing with the numbers in this way helps give you a little bit better idea how changing these physical properties results in modifying the f number. Likewise, if I have some diameter of 1 and I change my focal length by doubling the focal length, that also changes the amount of light that is being captured by this lens. There's a good reason for that, and again, I don't want to get into too many specifics of this because we can talk a lot more about this when we get into optics. But to address the question directly, bigger numbers mean that for a given lens, the aperture is going to be smaller. Okay, let's move on. So really, we've talked now about 3 major settings that go into exposure, but really this is glossing over the most important aspect that defines exposure, which is the amount of available light. If you want to modify your exposure, if you want to be able to take a picture with different exposure values, not only can you modify those 3 values, but in many cases you can also change the amount of available light. In this room, for example, we could modify the amount of light that is being shown by turning down the lights or perhaps by adding additional lights by using flash, for example. In some cases, that's not always possible, particularly for large landscapes. It becomes very difficult for you to intentionally change the amount of light that's there. Sometimes when we get to that level, we start thinking about coming at a different time when the sun is at a different place in the sky, waiting for the weather to change. As you can imagine, cloudy days have less light than pure sunny days, and this can impact the exposure settings that we use on our camera. And this is, generally speaking, the most important thing when we're discussing exposure is the amount of light that we have available to us, because ultimately that really defines how we can manipulate the rest of these settings. If it's extremely dark, we're going to have a very limited amount of latitude in each of these exposure settings in order to capture enough light for the camera. We're generally going to have to use a high ISO and a long shutter speed and a low f number to be able to allow as much light as possible into the camera in order to capture it at all. But each of this has nuance, and we'll talk again in more detail about this in the upcoming weeks. Now, when we're talking about the amount of available light, there's a good rule that you can use, and just like many rules, this is approximate, but for a bright sunny day, you can apply the Sunny 16 rule, which says that you can use these 3 exposure settings in the following way. You can use 1/100th of a second at ISO 100th and an f number of 16. Now, this was really useful in the film days. These were good settings to apply because you would generally buy ISO 100 film. you would have a lens that could stop down to f/16, and it was pretty easy to set your camera to 1/100th of a second. And this is a great way if you are very interested in sort of learning how to use your camera in a more manual way. Go outside during a sunny day, set your camera to these settings, and start playing with these settings to keep the exposure correct while modifying each of these things to some effect. So 1/100th of a second is reasonably fast, but let's say that I wanted to try to increase the speed. Let's say that I'm outside and I'm taking some sports photography and I want to increase the speed of my shutter from 1/100th of a second. What can I do in this case? What settings can I change, and how should I change them? Yes? I could change the ISO, yes. So I could change, if I change the ISO to 200, then that means that I have a stop more latitude in the shutter speed, and so I can go to 1/200th of a second. What else could I do? Yes?
Lower the f-stop?
Absolutely, lower the f-stop. So f/16 is a very high f number, particularly in digital cameras. You will rarely want to exceed f11 or f8 even in some digital cameras. Yada, 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 optics reasons, physics reasons for this, what we will go into at a later point in time. But generally speaking, once you get to about here, this is like the danger zone for digital cameras. The reason for that is it's still capable of taking the photograph, but it becomes very soft. Even though we are now using a higher f number, which means in our minds that we should then have more of our scene actually in focus, for different physics reasons altogether, the overall image just becomes soft. We'll talk more about this and why this happens and all those things at a later point in time. But generally speaking, f/16 makes me kind of nervous as a digital photographer. I want to try to primarily first decrease that number at least to f8. And if I do decrease it to f8, what would my shutter speed now be at ISO 100? So first thing, how many stops difference is it from f/16 to f8? And then apply that to the shutter speed. And what would be the shutter speed? So first of all, faster or slower shutter speed? Faster, yeah. 1/200th would be one stop change, but from f/16 to f11 is one stop. We go down to f8, which is two stops change, so we go to 1/400th of a second. 1/100 to 1/200th is one stop. 1/200 to 1/400th is another stop. This is excellent stuff to go try on your own, and part of the reason why we encourage you to take so many photos in this class is because in order for you to get a really good sense of this, and it's not even really memorizing the math, but you just get a much better sense of how these things are actually interacting in a much better way than me talking at you about how these settings are actually impact your image. So I highly encourage you to go outside in a sunny day, use these settings and start to manipulate them and see if you can maintain, using a full manual mode on your camera, see if you can maintain a properly exposed photograph. Now, depending on where exactly you are in the world and how, if there's any cloud at all in the sky, this might actually change. This is a bright, sunny day, sort of assuming you're in the United States. But as soon as you go up north a little bit more, even the light has to go through more of the atmosphere, and so you'll actually get a little bit less light. And so don't be surprised if it's not exactly correct. This is a starter for you to manipulate. So just to give you an idea, if it's slightly overcast from the sunny 16 rule, you go down a stop to f11. If it's overcast, then you go down 2 stops. If it's heavily overcast, try going down 3 stops to f5.6. But really, this is enough for you to get started in the manual mode on your cameras. Did I see a question?
Yeah, I was wondering if going over f16 is unique to digital cameras that it would get soft, because Angela Adams advocated f64.
So the question was, is it unique to digital cameras that we that going to high f numbers causes the image to be soft. There's, again, confounding factors here. The size of the film or the sensor is has a big impact on what f number results in a soft image. I would wager that f64, even on a regular film camera, would be pretty soft. Ansel Adams used much larger format, almost like 8x10 photographic plates, which means that in his photographs, he likely didn't get the same physics problem until much higher f numbers, probably f256 or 512 or something along those lines. He may not have ever had that. And that could have been one of the reasons why he recommended f64, was because beyond that, you started getting the softness that was present in the images. So this is actually an optics problem overall. It's not just digital cameras. It applies to any optical system that is going to use a lens and an aperture more specifically. So physicists that actually use like lasers with lenses to manipulate their stuff also have to contend with this. And this is all very abstract and all very mysterious, but I want to keep you coming back for more, and we'll talk more about this exact problem in a later lecture. Okay? So this idea of exposure is just really, really important. And this idea of stops makes a lot more elements of photography come into play. So if we were to talk about like taking photographs in space, for example, we can really apply some of this knowledge along with some other facts about what happens out in space to really understand why some of these images that we have seen look the way that they do. So this is a photograph from the moon, obviously, and some people contend that this was manufactured largely because there's no stars. They're like, oh, they're out in space. Why don't I see any stars? Well, part of the reason is that the sun, the light coming from the sun is just so much brighter than the light coming from the other stars that the exposure that was necessary for them to capture this photograph needed to be tuned to the sun and not to the stars. And so as a result, the dim stars just faded away into essentially non-existence in terms of the camera, because it was so much dimmer compared to the actual light coming from the sun itself. In fact, we see this in all sorts of photos where we have the sun and it's very extremely harsh light not reflecting off the atmosphere. So the other thing to consider here is that here on Earth we have an atmosphere. The molecules in the atmosphere reflect the light and scatter it in some way. It's why the sky looks blue, et cetera, et cetera. But it also is an important part of our discussion here, is that if we're not reflecting the light in the atmosphere, then it is going to look very harsh because there's nowhere for this light to actually reflect. Now there is actually, that's only sort of true, right? The rim of this crater right here does in fact reflect a little bit of light, but even that is so comparatively little to what we would normally experience that the light coming from the sun is extremely harsh, and we capture only those portions of the image that are properly illuminated by the sun. So these other portions of the image that have faded away into shadows and into obscurity are there not because it's not illuminated at all, but because there is no atmosphere to reflect light and sort of fill those shadows at all. Right now it's just one light source, the sun, shining light effectively in sort of these parallel rays and illuminating only portions of this moon's surface which is visible, which have visibility to the sun. And all other portions of this image do have detail, but it's just too dark for this particular sensor to be able to capture that detail. And we're talking about a difference we're probably talking about a difference of about, 15 stops or something like that, which may not sound like very much, but if you do the math, 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, 15 times, we're talking about an enormous difference in the actual quantity of light in the various regions of this photograph. So it's an important thing to keep in mind, but this is really an exaggerated example of things that we see here on Earth, which are photos that are perhaps not properly exposed. So right here we actually have some regions that are properly exposed, which the moon's surface here that actually have contact with the sunlight, and portions of the moon that are totally in shadow and are completely underexposed. Arguably, this image is properly exposed. The reason for that is, well, we can see the features on the moon, and also it looks as though the Earth is properly exposed as well. But just because some regions of this image are in fact completely underexposed and have no visible detail at all, doesn't mean that the image as a whole, in fact, is underexposed. And this is some of the subjective aspect of an image that has to go into your consideration of what is proper exposure. But these are still useful terms to be able to think about and discuss whether or not we have nailed the exposure for a particular image. So generally speaking, underexposed means that the important aspects of the image, the subject perhaps, in some naive view, the subject itself has no detail. It is underexposed because it's too dark for us to capture the detail there. Similarly, we could say an image is overexposed if the subject has no detail because it is so bright that there's no longer any detail. In fact, we can see that here just in these swaths of snow that look like bright patches of white with no detail inside them whatsoever. In fact, there's probably some texture here in the snow itself, or maybe even just some ripples and divots as the snow melted and re-solidified into some ice. But we don't see that because the overall image is overexposed. And sometimes in particularly harsh environments like out in space, or even taking a picture of the bright outside light and the inner part of a bridge, you can get both underexposure and overexposure. In that case, you're going to have to do something else entirely. It's going to be a very difficult thing to try to solve. Generally, in this case, and if we were to come up with an image like this on the upper right, I would say, well, first of all, wait until sunset or sunrise when the light outside will be softer and it will be not quite as harsh, and you might have a better chance. You might also try to do something like fill flash. You might try to have a flash unit off to the side, or maybe even along this right wall pointed towards the left to supply additional light to the inside of the bridge as well. You could try to have some sort of a reflector. You can just go home, get a white sheet, and set up your camera on a tripod and just hold up the white sheet, trying to reflect light coming from the sun into some particularly dark illuminated area. You can do that, or you can actually go to a photographic store and buy an actual reflector, which looks like a big circle with a shiny surface, and then you can do it a little bit more, you can do it perhaps with a little bit more control, but each of these are just different ways that you would be able to modify the light that already exists in your image and try to fix any particular exposure problems that you happen to have. You could also do something else entirely, which would be a mechanism called bracketing, where you can take multiple exposures of the same scene on a tripod, change nothing but some exposure values by several stops. So you might take an underexposed image that has the sky properly exposed, for example, and then increase the exposure a little bit to try to capture the overall scene, and then continue increasing the exposure values so that you can then capture the details inside the bridge, and then later in software you can merge them using some masking techniques and some other things that we will talk about not only in class, but I'm sure if you're interested, your TFs can go over in section as well. Many of them are masters in doing bracketing and some of this fantastic software modification. But really, the other thing to consider is that the light that we have in a scene really, really matters. If you have good light, it can really make or break, well, it really will make the image as opposed to bad light. Sometimes waiting just a little bit of time for the sun and the harsh rays that it's sort of illuminating onto your scene can greatly impact the quality of the photograph. Generally speaking, especially for landscape, or well, just generally speaking, outside, you're able to capture phenomenal images in the same location by just waiting for sunset or sunrise, and that the soft light will do a number of things. The reason we call it soft is that it's more dispersed, so we no longer get as harsh of the shadows as we would with just a harsh sunlight beaming down on our scene. It also exaggerates color in the sky due to just more scattering of the light. The light is going through additional volume of atmosphere and scattering more, and we get to see more of the other hues as a result from that light. Even having a cloudy or overcast day can really help soften a lot of the very harsh shadows that can occur in the middle of an afternoon, and that can also help with some of the images that you take as well. But really, I cannot emphasize enough that beyond these 3 exposure values and modifying the knowledge of how to modify them to capture the vision that you have for a particular photograph, waiting for the right light or manipulating the scene if you happen to be inside of a studio or have the ability to manipulate the scene to get the light just right is really, really powerful way of improving your photography. Now, there's a lot of ways that we can think about modifying exposure and doing intentional underexposure or overexposure to exaggerate some things. And you can, in fact, at home, just very easily make sort of a quick and dirty studio that you can use to take photographs in a very controlled lighting environment. These 2 photographs were taken just with a couple of lamps and some paper and also a white and black shirt, black and white shirt respectively, and no real major modifications other than that, and just sort of having good control over this and making sure that elements of the scene have the proper amount of light for the subject, and applying more light to areas that you want to have a bright background, and applying less light to those that you want to have a dark background is a way that you can sort of take these studio-style shots without needing very much expensive equipment other than a camera, a tripod, and a couple of black T-shirts and some lamps. We can talk more about methods of how you'd be able to do this for a given scene, probably in section, but it's certainly something worth trying at home as well, as being able to have that mastery of control over exposure, that you can not only modify the exposure settings to get the image that you want, but also modify the light in the scene to try to capture this. You can sort of imagine that in the case of the photograph on the right, we have to apply so much more light to the background than the subject to be able to get that overexposed and have no detail in that background. And conversely, we want to apply so little light to the background on the left photograph compared to the subject itself that the opposite happens, that it's so dark that no details actually appear in the photograph. And this is it. This is exposure. These are the big 3 things, other than the amount of light that exists in the photograph itself, or in the scene itself, that allow you to really have control over your photography. And so I hope that from here on out you start to practice with this and use it to your advantage. And next week we'll talk more about metering. I'll rant a little bit about metering modes and about why you don't need them anymore, and how you can use the advanced modes on your camera to really do everything that you will want with your camera. And until then, I thank you all very much for coming. Please enjoy sections, and we will see you next week.